this here?
Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Gurjeet, for having me. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, University of Michigan. Trigger warning, there might be minor images of blood and gore. What do vascular surgeons do on X? Apart from trash posting, that is. I'm going to use X and Twitter interchangeably because let's face it, the definitiveness of the noun and verb tweet is not encompassed by the word post. This is indeed real blood, yes. That's my an embolectomy is when you clean out an artery, you take a clot out, and in the process, you get sprayed with a whole lot of blood. Slides aren't moving. Sorry, I click. No. I need to click there. What do? I press this? Or? Yeah, all right. So let me start with my story. I'm a vascular and endovascular surgeon. I sew, repair, reconstruct, restore to working order blood vessels everywhere in the body for pleasure and profit. So I'm a bit of a glorified human plumber. But I'm also a writer. Well, this is a novel that I wrote in 2007. It's called Perineum, Nether Parts of the Empire. And my introductory chestnut is that it's a rogue and deviant fictive sexual history of the British Raj. This is a kind of happy union of fraudulent history and excitable hokum. My wife likes to call it smutty historical fiction. It charts the colonial arc from Robert Clive to Jinnah. The perineum is the part of the body between the thighs. It's the seat of all our essential biological imperatives. It's where the genitals are. It's where the plumbing is. It's where the clockwork is. So in the book, perineum is accorded historical agency. So the book starts with a story about Robert Clive's circumcision. This is Clive of India. And it ends with Muhammad Ali Jinnah's last ejaculation. One of the stories in the book is called Baker's Scrotum. It's about this great wrangle between Edwin Lutyens and Herbert Baker, the two architects of Imperial Delhi. Lutyens and Baker had initially concurred in placing the government house, which is Viceroy's house, or what is now Rashtrapati Bhavan, and the two secretariats on Raisina Hill. The government house was made by Lutyens, and Baker made the two secretariats. Their agreement to place all of this on Raisina Hill was based on a series of watercolors called Walcott's Perspectives. What happened was that the angle of the gradient that was depicted in Walcott's Perspectives was incorrect. Actually, it was much more acute than what they had expected and what was depicted. So what happened was, as you ascend up the hill, the secretariat blocks, they completely occlude the view of the government house, of Rashtrapati Bhavan. And this was malicious as far as Lutyens was concerned. And he made several representations to the government. You know, this needs to change, but they said, sorry, go and ask Baker. Baker did not capitulate. So it ended up being like that. And Lutyens thought that his masterpiece had been marred forever. So all affinity between the two architects dwindled and kind of wound down in great haste, and their association came to an end much before Delhi's inaugural celebrations. So in the story that is in the book, which is called Baker's Scrotum, Baker receives providential punishment in the form of a condition called Funia gangrene. This is an infection and a spontaneous kind of liquefaction and necrosis of the skin of the scrotum by a kind of flesh-eating bacterium. I'm not going to show you images. But the necrotic, the dead skin over the scrotum and the perineum has to be surgically incrementally removed. And then the infection has to be cleared by various methods. So in the story, none of this happened, but in the story, Baker has to kind of lower his perineum into a receptacle, into a large vessel, which is full of bleaching powder solution 3 times a day for 45 minutes, till all the infection is washed out. And after a while, the wound kind of clears up. But unfortunately, the scrotum had ceased to exist. So the testicles are kind of exposed. And there's absolutely no skin to give it cover. In Delhi, which was still under construction, there was no one who could surgically salvage the situation. So they call in a professor of surgery from Madras Medical College, who takes a look and, he effects a kind of unlikely resolution, which is that he says, look, what I'm going to do is I'm going to transpose the testicles with the attendant spermatic cords into the inner aspect of the thighs. So it's like burying, if you can imagine, the testicles into the adjacent part of the thighs. And once that's out of the way, then the skin can be mobilized and closed with sutures. Now, Baker's perineum and his groin, in the end, becomes a kind of metaphor for Raisina. His testicles, which are homologous to the Secretariat buildings, are finally out of the way. And Lutyens, in his journal entry, writes that Nemesis is finally upon Baker. His testicular secretariats are out of the central axis. Why am I telling you this? The reason I'm telling you this is because this is what physicians and surgeons do. When they're not doing health-related discourse, they find a way of directly or indirectly or obliquely writing about medicine, disease, pathology. That's the only thing they're capable of doing. The marrow and the pith for the story came to me from a young Delhi police constable who was infected with HIV and who had suffered from Funia gangrene and who was under my care for about 3 months. I used to work for the government then. And I had to actually transpose his testicles to salvage the situation. This should be an acknowledged truism. This was once uttered by Rudolf Virchow, the German pathologist. Medicine is a social science because it deals with the understanding of physical bodies of social organisms in a social context. And it's perhaps a great metaphor for understanding society. Is there an affiliation between medicine and creative expression? Well, many physicians and surgeons have achieved prominence as writers. And I'd like to submit that medicine is equally an affective art as it is a rational art. And the physician-patient interaction is actually an exchange of narratives. Storytelling is perhaps the most fundamental and necessary unit of medical epistemology. Doctors listen to patients' stories. They ritualistically exchange stories when they're discussing cases or presenting cases. Everything is a narrative: medical history, the grand rounds, medical charts. In fact, the word for medical history is anamnesis. It's a wonderful word. It comes from Old Greek. It means remembrance. So part of the written project of medicine is actually transforming the patient into text. That is to be documented, archived, understood, and slotted. This book, by common consent, is perhaps one of the greatest books written about cricket, by C.L.R. James. In the preface to this book, James paraphrases Kipling, and he asks this rather probing and profound question: what do they know of cricket who only cricket know? And I think the point he's trying to make is that if you wish to understand cricket in the Caribbean islands, it's not possible to do it without referencing West Indian society and culture and history. And conversely, if you wish to understand West Indian history and culture, it's not possible to do it without referencing perhaps their most popular defining activities, which is cricket. So to properly reflect on anything, one must know everything about everything, because everything is connected. At some point in my life, the ghosts of CLR James and Rudolf Virchow kind of pulled a lever and roused me to attach more freight to my engine than I'm capable of carrying. And I began to encroach upon areas of expertise which I have, no knowledge of. It's called, epistemic transgressions, they say. And I started fancying myself as an essayist. And I started writing op-eds and columns for various newspapers and magazines. My book, Perineum, had a shelf life of somewhere between milk and yogurt. So I thought it'd be nice, to have a kind of monthly byline somewhere in a national broadsheet or a magazine, roughly once a month. So for about 10 years, I wrote a column every month somewhere. It was my attempt at trying to stay visible, noticeable, and relevant. This was a theory on the evolutionary purpose of breasts. This was my theory on the abomination of the porcine, of pig's meat in Islam and Judaism. The essay is a kind of literary device which allows you to write almost anything about almost anything. So in that sense, it's a formless form. And it gave me the latitude to write about once a month about whatever I fancied that month. This was a piece about how Mandir Wahi Banayenge was first uttered by Theodor Herzl, president of the World Zionist Congress in 1897. This was about a PR experiment which attached capnolagnia, or the smoking fetish, to modern femininity. This was about eating offal. This was about the Mahuriyat cesarean section. The thing about writing a column, and we have so many journalists here, far more accomplished than I can ever be, the thing about writing a column, as they say, it's like pissing off a cliff, because you don't know where it'll land, if it will reach people and how many, but one must soldier on. This was my life before social media. To that point, social media for me was a kind of spectator sport. And then this happened. It meant unrelenting work for my fraternity through all the madness. In the beginning of May 2020, I sent a WhatsApp message on the Neighborhood Resident Welfare Association group where I live. What precipitated it was news of the first COVID case in our locality and the incredibly incontinent and hysteric neighborly anxiety over that discovery, and also the scary commandeering of the situation by the Neighborhood Resident Welfare Association. So a journalist friend and neighbor asked me, look, can you give everyone the lay of the land? And I decided to type out a message on my phone, which expanded into a 1,000-word missive cum memo. And I sent it out in the evening. And the next morning, I got a call from Kolkata, Bengaluru, New York, and Manchester that, look, there's a message going around in your name. Have you written it? It was the first time I could sense firsthand that things actually travel at the speed of light on WhatsApp. It was astonishing how much the piece got run. Perhaps every Anglophone Indian with a smartphone read it. I mean, its transmission can be a case study in mass communication. This is a couplet by Akbar Allahabadi. बूट डासन ने बनाया, मैंने एक मजमून लिखा, मुल्क में मजमू ना फैला और जूता चल गया. इन दिस केस मुल्क में मजमू और कोविड दोनों फैल गए. As the COVID-19 pestilence spread through the community, it was almost as though our most primal fear as human beings was being realized. The specter of a kind of silent, stalking killer. Everyone was forced to confront the prospect of their own mortality for the first time in their lives. And there was need for communication. That's how my Twitter threads began. For me and many others, providing information seemed almost as important as not abandoning my posted work. It was what was expected of us in the pandemic. Some of us also had to fight the system. The Epidemics Act was in place, and this gave the government extreme and drastic powers. What we were seeing was a classic Malthusian crisis. The virus was multiplying exponentially, and resources could only be added arithmetically. And there was always going to be scarce resources to fight this. But in a bid to keep numbers down, my hospital, which is one of the largest tertiary hospitals in India, wasn't allowed to test for COVID by the Delhi government. And I wrote a thread about it. An FIR was filed and criminal action was initiated against us for testing for COVID in the middle of a COVID pandemic. Suddenly, I was completely out of my depth. I found myself in primetime television, in debates, forced into verbal duels with politicians. Not something I'd set out to do. A couple of months later, when things got really bad and we were still struggling with treatment algorithms, particularly in really sick patients who were having cytokine storms, the vaccine was nowhere in sight. We found out that this kind of murderous virus was actually attacking blood vessels and causing vascular thrombosis. It explained why a whole lot of young and middle-aged patients barely ill with COVID were suddenly dying of strokes and getting their limbs amputated. At my hospital, we were operating on COVID patients every day. We were trying to get clots out of arteries. We had a hunch about SARS-CoV-2's vascular affinity much before the paper that I showed you came out, but we couldn't in any way declare it because at that point we did not know the molecular basis for vascular thrombosis in COVID. I posted this image on Twitter and I wrote a thread about it. It was the second time I achieved notability and virality in life. I was then, without warning, upgraded to the status of a COVID expert. I found myself in all kinds of television panels on COVID, again, out of my depth. As Gore Vidal said, one must never pass up the opportunity of having sex and appearing on television. But quite frankly, this was getting to be burdensome and tiring. I remember once, I think it was this one time, on Rajdeep's show, that we were discussing a new variant that was spotted in Britain. And I think it was christened the Kent variant. And on primetime national television, I ended up calling it the cunt variant. So it was a spinal level that I was working by then. But anyway, congratulations to all of us. We've lived through a pandemic. As someone said, you know, imagine your 2019 self trying to make sense of this sentence. But let me pause my story and go back to the original question. What do vascular surgeons do on Twitter? Well, mostly they flex and write field notes and share clinical and intraoperative photographs and peer-reviewed papers and hold polls and quizzes and make other kinds of sundry wisecracks. and live tweet during conferences, and sometimes troll their comrades. Twitter for most physicians and surgeons is like a Tocquevillian socio-political association. It's a staging ground for fun and games, but it's also meant for continuing education and recreation of its members. Some of my own offerings on Twitter have been along those lines. I wrote threads that gave thrilling accounts of surgical cases. I flexed about happy outcomes, clearly in difficult circumstances. Sometimes I high-fived other comrades. But X is a public square. Everybody can see these posts. And it's possible that the laity doesn't like seeing them. If you read this, you realize there is a reason why people believe that medicine is a conspiracy against the laity. I don't know if you can read this, but the National Medical Commission, the apex regulatory body that governs medical education and clinical practice in India, has come out with a set of guidelines. They're currently held in abeyance, but they don't freely allow physicians and surgeons to engage on social media. In my view, as far as doctors are concerned, I think self-promotion should be the dirtiest hyphenated word in the English language. It's indecorous, it's ignoble, it's slightly dishonorable. But I don't need to say this in front of this gathering of experts. That being said, all of social media is self-aggrandizement and self-promotion. All public accounts of individuals are in service of the self. So how do I present myself on social media without trying to promote myself? What I really like doing on X is the entertainment of strangers. And it's mostly not with the vascular stuff. This would be elementary to most people in the audience, but the success of a tweet or a series of tweets depends on dissemination. And outside of propaganda, I'd like to believe that it's mostly organic. It's a settled matter that the future of hits and blockbusters on the internet is largely democratic. I know Gunjan mentioned yesterday about seeding and how trends can be manufactured, but of course, the fact is that if you don't like something, you wouldn't share it. So in that sense, it's largely democratic. As a writer on Twitter, I've constantly grappled with the question of how do I write something that people would want to share on their own? Because a tweet is a digital good that is specifically designed for evangelism marketing. The point of the tweet is that if people like it, they will be evangelical about it, because everyone in Twitter is a broadcasting station. In my limited capacity, I found that I can entertain strangers by telling them stories in the form of threads, and I find the form of the thread particularly fascinating. And we've established earlier that the essay can be about anything. A thread is meant to evoke a single effect. It's a crafted form in its own right. Edgar Allan Poe believed that all literary works should necessarily be short. He said that there has to be a distinct limit as regards length to all literary works, and it's the limit of a single sitting. Consider the audacity of the thread. It's a peculiar artifact. It's a piece of prose that's written in bite-sized, digestible fragments that is programmatically not meant to be boring and not allowed to be boring. If the first sentence doesn't seize the imagination of the reader, she will abandon it and scroll to something else. The next tweet in the thread necessarily has to fulfill the promissory strum of the earlier one, and so on, or it's not going to work. There's a visual separation between the tweets, which allows the reader to pause and degust what she's read. If it's not good enough, she will abandon it and leave. And all of this is self-published in a digital marketplace which encourages only digital grazing. It's not meant for long-form reading. So as a writer, when you're writing a thread, you're constantly measuring what you're writing against how you're writing it. Can a tweet be a work of literary art? Well, if it can be art in a non-fungible token kind of way, then of course it can be a form of literature as well. Before that, the tweet has to be crafted in language that draws attention to itself. The origin of the word essay is from Old French essai, which means a trial or an attempt. Every so often, I try. I'm not a howling success at this, but I try. This was a thread, for instance, on the lactational secretions of the cow. It actually asks the question, is the cow a person or a thing, or a sentient non-person? And is this nomination based on policy, theology, or biology? There's another thread. There are times when you need a clickbait. This was about the death of Parveen Babi, and it ended up being about diabetic foot sepsis. This was a 90-tweet thread, but it was shared by about 2,500 people. And for about 30 tweets into the thread, the reader has no idea where this is going. This is the story of a secret love song hidden in Brahms's lullaby. A thread about Thomas Paine's connection to Phule and Ambedkar. A thread about why the Operation Theatre is called theatre. A thread about a hidden image and a message in one of Michelangelo's panels in the Sistine Chapel. This is the second tweet in the thread. A thread about the mystery of the white shaitut. If the evolutionary purpose of the mulberry tree is not to produce mulberries, but to produce mulberry trees, then for the success of this scheme, obviously, shouldn't the sweetest mulberries be the most seductively colored? I don't know if you can read this, but it says in South Asia, a diabetic person waking up with blood on the sheets and wounds on the toes that weren't there the previous night is almost always because of a rat nibbling and snacking on the toes at night. It ends up linking to Marico's Nariyal Ka Tel. A thread about Dabholkar. This thread interrogates, he was from my college, perhaps the only mentionable alumnus of my medical college, Government Medical College, Meerut. And the thread interrogates whether Dabholkar's law, which was the anti-superstition bill that he drafted, can challenge the ecclesiastical claims of Ram Rahim Insan and the resurrection of Christ. Can it challenge Satyanarayan Puja? This was a thread about perhaps the most maverick vascular surgeon ever, Denton Cooley. Can you read this? Yeah? Can you guess what this is about? Which is by common consensus, sorry? No, it's King James's Bible. This is a fascinating story. But I can't tell you these stories now because they have to be received and read in the form of tweets. Twitter is still largely the written word. I've often wondered how the greats would have crafted threads on Twitter to compose in 280 characters paragraphs that are more evocative than what you can manage in regular prose. If that were the brief, imagine what the subversive brilliance of someone like Christopher Hitchens or Martin Amis or Susan Sontag would have produced. This is one of those enduringly beautiful lines from Sontag's book on photography, and it's under 280 characters. If Twitter existed then, and Sontag had repurposed some of her essays into a thread, it would have reached a completely different readership. Rushdie and Ghosh are on Twitter, Amitav Ghosh, as are some of our great public intellectuals and opinion makers and masters of the narrative arts. These are writers who've shown us how to look at the world and shown us how to think, but they never write for Twitter. If they did, they'd show us how it's done. I recently found out that Rebecca Solnit is on Twitter, and she does threads, and they're brilliant. And these are screenshots of her threads. I'd urge you to go and read them at leisure. I think Hussain will agree with this. Poetry is costly prose because it's harder to write. But I think Hussain will also agree that text that is drafted specifically for virality is perhaps the hardest to write. I'll conclude by this. Are you wasting merchantable literature by making it into a digital public good? There's also the matter of prestige. These are questions that writers will be asked when they might write threads. And this will need an adequate resolution. Christopher Hitchens was once asked if he ever kept a diary. And his response was that it would be useful to keep a diary, but I don't like writing unpaid. Thank you very much.